Now today we'll be replacing a top strut mount, and very quickly before we begin I'm going to attempt to pick up the noise that I'm hearing on camera. It's very subtle, it's not too bad at this point, but I want to tackle the job before the winter comes and it gets really cold out. But that being said, let me just see if I can pick up the noise, just in case if you're hearing something similar on your vehicle, you can sort of have a connection point in that sense. Now I'm not sure if you could pick that up, but it's coming from the front left of the vehicle. So let's bring it in the garage, jack it up, and we'll get to work. Now I'm disconnecting the negative terminal to the battery just in case on some vehicles you may have to disconnect the ABS sensor. You don't want to take any chances if there's a cross somewhere. This is your strut assembly. It's essentially the shock system. Now what I want to do before I begin is keep the alignment intact. And to do that, there's a camber adjusting bolt, which is essentially the two lower mounts. Usually it's just the top one, but if you're not sure, just mark both bolts. So as you can see, I've done some work in the past, but just take some paint and mark up the bolt to the body. So when you reinstall everything, you get to line everything back up and keep your alignment intact. And I'll do the same on both of them here. So right here we have a connection point for the brake hose. Just want to loosen that up. And then we have another attachment point for the ABS line. So now we need to loosen the two bottom strut bolts. Now these are very tight. They're roughly 115, 120 foot-pounds. So I'm going to use a breaker bar. Now I want to break the nut loose. You want to remove the nut and keep the bolt stationary. So I'm using a breaker bar, and I'll use a wrench to hold the nut. Let me give you a different angle so you can see my setup. Of course, if you have power tools, that will certainly help, but it's not necessary. Now the key when removing bolts with just basic hand tools, you need a long handle. Makes all the difference. Without a long handle, forget it, you'll be there all day. So again, just breaking the bolt loose. And once it's loose, whoops, then we'll grab a ratchet. And of course, you can always spray these down with WD-40, PB Blaster. Now the strut is held in by these three bolts. We just need to remove these as well. And this is just a little PB Blaster. Now again, to break these loose, I'm just taking a socket that fits over the end of the ratchet to give me a really long handle. Whoops. And then I'll remove this last bolt and remove the strut from the vehicle. Now before we compress the spring and remove the top mount, I just want to take pictures of how everything is seated. So the top of the spring, the diameter is smaller compared to the bottom. And also I'm just noting where the paint marks are. This is from the factory. So now I have the strut assembly firmly held in place using a bench vise. It's not necessary, but it certainly makes the job easier because when you remove this nut, it'll be hard holding this down and trying to remove this nut. It's going to wobble everywhere. So this is certainly a good idea. Secondly, you need a spring compression tool. Now you can typically rent these for free at your local auto parts store. And what you want to do is hold the spring in place, so when you remove this top strut mount, it's not going to spring out and hurt you, someone else, property damage, that sort of thing. And I'll tighten down the other side as well. Now, interestingly enough, this is a 2010 Subaru, and of course these newer vehicles, they like to make things difficult. Now, not every car is like this. They can be typically a lot easier to remove, but essentially I need to hold this in place. This is a 6mm Allen wrench. Use a good quality. This is a Craftsman. And then I need a wrench to back out this turn. It's a locking nut. And I don't have a tool right now that's going to fit. I may have to run to Sears and grab something. But you essentially want, let me give you an example here. You want something like this. You need that kind of angle. I just don't have a 17. This is a 17mm bolt. So in other words, you want something to fit in there, and you have to hold this in place. So I'm going to attempt to remove it without purchasing any other tools. I'm just going to use a 17mm socket. I'm guessing it's not going to work. Otherwise, I'll have to run to the store real quick and grab another wrench. And of course, don't forget your safety glasses. And then there's a washer in between the seat and the top strut mount in this case. In this case, this needs to be tightened down to 40 foot-pounds. And then I just want to double check, make sure that the spring is seated correctly, because again, once this is tightened down, I don't want to take it back apart. And if you're curious, there's really only one way for this to fit. It's a little tricky on your own, but there we go. Now the new mount does include new bolts as well, and in this case these need to be torqued down to 15 foot-pounds, which isn't that much. If you don't have a torque wrench, again, you don't really have to over tighten these, because 15 foot-pounds is not that much. And then don't forget the dust cap that goes on top. So now I want to mark up my alignment tabs, and then when I reinstall the nut, I'm going to hold this in place and tighten the nut from this end. Now in this case, these have to be 115 foot-pounds, which is a pretty good guide for most vehicles. Just take note, in this case there's a washer for the top bolt, but there's no washer for the bottom bolt. So just keep that in mind whenever you do something like this. You don't want to start mixing and matching things. If you ever get confused, very quickly, if you do a web search for your vehicle, a lot of times you can find schematics showing exactly how everything goes back together. And whenever you finish using a torque wrench, just make sure you set it back down to 0. It just keeps the longevity of your torque wrench. And as a final check, our alignment tabs line up. I've reattached the brake line, the ABS line. I'll throw the tire back on the car. Usually around 80 foot-pounds if you want to torque the lug nuts. 75, 80 foot-pounds is a good number. Take it for a quick test drive and we should be in good shape.